Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving deep into some truly fascinating source material you've shared with us, specifically excerpts from a book on Western political thought, where we're taking a close look at the incredibly influential and often challenging ideas of Karl Marx.
That's right. And this isn't just a quick overview. We're really following the source material down into the foundational arguments it lays out.
Yeah, our mission for this deep dive is to properly unpack the core ideas this text presents about Karl Marx, his theories, his pretty powerful critique of Western thought.
And we want to pull out the most important insights, explore what the author here highlights about the impact and, the legacy of these ideas.
Think of this as your guided tour through this specific material. We'll walk you through the key concepts, try to connect the dots between them.
And hopefully help you quickly grasp the complex arguments being presented here.
Ready? Okay, let's unpack this.
So the text starts by kind of setting the stage, right? Placing modern communism within its historical context. It notes that while communist ideas might have ancient roots, the ideology that really popped up in the 19th century was something fundamentally new.
And it's immediately framed as being created in direct opposition to liberal ideas. That's a really crucial distinction the source makes straight away.
Definitely. Unlike conservatism, which often wanted to preserve things from the past, modern communism, well, like liberalism actually, understood the old order was gone. Things like the French Revolution had smashed it.
Society just had to grapple with the reality of this new modern industrial age. No going back.
Exactly. Both liberals and these emerging communists were responding to these huge shifts of industrialization. But, where liberals often saw progress, individual rights triumphing.
This new communist thought saw massive, unacceptable problems. Problems baked right into the structure of modern society itself.
Yeah. And the source tells us that back in the 19th century, socialism was a really broad term. Super vague, actually.
Covering all sorts of different thinkers, activists.
Right. What united them wasn't some single blueprint for the future. It was more their shared opposition. Opposition to the, frankly, brutal conditions of the new industrial society.
And opposition to the liberal ideas that seemed to justify, or at least kind of allow those conditions.
And the central driving issue for all these early socialists, according to this text, was the deteriorating conditions of the new industrial working class.
This material really hits hard on how extremely degrading these conditions were. Early industrial revolution stuff. We're talking terrible poverty, child labor, dangerous factories.
Overcrowded slums, yeah. It wasn't just hardship. The text says it was a level of human suffering so bad that it called into question the whole basis of modern society.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. And the text points out this deeply unsettling paradox of the time. Every increase in technological progress was matched by an increase in human suffering.
Wow, just think about that. More advanced technology, more misery. That's a huge knock against the whole idea of progress back then.
Absolutely. It's a core piece of the socialist critique starting point.
The source then talks about those early socialists, the ones often labeled utopian socialists.
Right. And it suggests that, while maybe well-intentioned, they weren't really equipped to explain why this suffering was happening systematically.
They saw the symptoms, but not the disease.
Sort of. And they couldn't offer truly realistic or, actionable solutions either, according to this text.
Just couldn't give practical steps?
Yeah, and they're apparently a pretty disparate group, the text notes, couldn't agree on the specifics of what a socialist society would actually look like.
Or, maybe even more critical, how you'd actually get there.
Pretty much. They generally advocated for some form of communal property or exchange, pushing back against that whole Lockean idea of private property rights.
Which, under these conditions, with workers suffering so much,
seemed to be the source of the problem, right? It seemed to be the root of the workers' misery.
Makes sense. And strategy-wise.
Yeah.
Were they unified there?
Not at all. Strategy was all over the map, too. Some were pushing for reforms. Others wanted outright revolution. It was, confused.
So the source argues that what the socialist movement really needed at this point was a thinker. Someone who could give it a sound theoretical basis.
Yeah, a foundation. Something grounded in a systematic understanding of society and history.
Something that could show socialism wasn't just a nice dream, but a real, viable alternative.
And potentially unite those fragmented socialist groups behind a clear analysis and maybe a strategy.
And this is where Karl Marx enters the picture. Presented here not just as the guy who provided that theoretical basis,
but as someone who, as the text puts it, truly called into question the whole tradition of Western social and political thought. That's a massive claim.
Huge. So Karl Marx, born in Prussia, 1818, got his doctorate in philosophy.
Then moves to Paris in 1843. Paris was like the hub of socialist thinking then.
And that's where he meets Friedrich Engels, a pivotal meeting.
Absolutely monumental, the source suggests. Their intellectual partnership lasted his entire life, until Marx died in 1883.
But his views were getting pretty radical.
Yeah, radical enough that he had to leave Paris in 1845, move to Brussels.
And it was in Brussels, 1848, that he and Engels co-authored the Communist Manifesto.
Which the text calls a classic of polemic literature, a real fiery call to action.
And 1848 itself was a huge year, right? Revolution shaking Europe.
It was. The source says Marx and Engels initially had high hopes. They expected these upheavals to spark a widespread working-class revolt, maybe bring in socialism right then.
But that didn't happen.
No. Their hopes were quickly dashed, as the text puts it. The working class didn't play that immediate revolutionary role they expected.
And the source flags this failure as being really important, crucial importance to the integrity of the whole Marxian theoretical system, something he had to reckon with.
Definitely. Its attention we'll probably come back to.
So after more moves, Marx ends up in London in 1849, stays there till he dies.
And in London, he was involved in organizing, like, the first International Working Men's Association.
But his main contribution, the source argues, was the deep theoretical work he did, especially in economics.
Right, which led to his magnum opus, Volume 1 of Capital, published in 1867.
The source calls it his most important and justifiably most famous work. And Engels published the later volumes after Marx passed away.
Yeah, the final one came out in 1894. By that point, the source says, Marx's ideas were pretty much dominant in the revolutionary socialist movement.
It calls Marxism the language of revolution, and also a profoundly important critique of Western social and political thought.
And here's a key takeaway the source offers, especially for those interested in political theory. The bigger critique of Western thought that Marx developed.
That's arguably even more significant in the long run than the specific details of his socialist vision or his plan for communist society.
Yeah, but you can't really get that critique unless you understand the theory it's built on.
And Marx didn't just offer it as an idea. He claimed it was scientific.
Right. He called it scientific socialism, specifically to contrast it with those earlier, maybe less rigorous utopian socialists.
He wanted to demonstrate its scientific validity. And that, the source says, needed a much bigger intellectual framework than the utopians had.
And that framework is based on what he called the materialist conception of history.
Okay, break that down. What's the core idea?
Marx argued that if you want to claim communism is possible, let alone inevitable, you need a scientific understanding of how history actually works, how it changes.
And his materialist view provided that understanding, he believed.
Exactly. And this immediately put him at odds with the dominant philosophy of his day, especially Hegelian philosophy, which was based on idealism.
Idealism. That's the idea that history is driven by ideas or spirit, right?
Yeah, basically. History as the unfolding of some kind of spiritual principle. Marx thought this was fundamentally wrong.
Why? What was the problem with idealism for him?
He insisted it led thinkers away from the truth. Instead of studying actual human beings' real, physical parts of the material world, idealists got lost in abstractions, in spirit, in pure thought.
So Marx's theory was developed partly as a critique of idealism and how it interpreted history.
Precisely. He laid out this critique and his materialist alternative in the German ideology, written with Engels back in 1846.
And the starting point for materialism is?
Really basic, actually. The source quotes it. The first premise of all human existence is that men must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history.
Obvious when you think about it. You have to eat, have shelter, just exist materially before you can do anything else, before you can philosophize or build states or anything.
Right. Before you can make history, you have to survive concretely as actual existing material entities.
So for Marx, any valid analysis of history has to start there, with how humans materially produce their existence.
Not just individually, but as a species. How we reproduce ourselves, how we sustain ourselves. He calls these the basic productive or historical acts.
Things like getting food, building shelter, developing tools and technologies.
And also social reproduction, perpetuating the species. These are the foundations.
And the source says these acts have always happened together. What changes is how we do them.
Exactly. The ways change, technology improves, the whole mode of production evolves over time.
And here's a crucial bit. This productive activity is inherently social. We don't usually do it alone.
Right. And these productive acts, understood in their social fora, are what Marx calls the relations of production, how we relate to each other in the process of producing things.
So if technology changes or the way we produce changes,
It must alter those relations and therefore alter the entire society. It's all interconnected.
and these relations of production are structured mainly by the division of labor.
Yes. Every society has some way of dividing up tasks, a mode of cooperation, who does what, based on the technology available, etc.
Like the source mentions, basic forms, sexual division, or maybe stronger people hunting, others gathering, spontaneous divisions.
But the text highlights a really critical turning point for Marx, the point where the division of labor becomes the basis for the whole social order.
And that happens when?
When a fundamental split appears between material and mental labor.
So when a small group, priests, scribes, philosophers, later on separates itself from physical work.
To focus just on intellectual stuff, thinking, writing, theorizing. Once that happens, Marx argues, the basic structure of class society starts to lock into place.
And this structure, for Marx, is inherently one of class exploitation.
Yes, because the division of labor isn't just about doing different things, it's also a division of property.
How so?
Marx argues that this division of property is essentially social class. Those doing certain tasks, especially that mental labor early on, get rewarded more unequally.
The source quotes him saying division of labor and private property are identical expressions.
Right. And the source adds an interesting note. Marx took this definition of property, tying it to labor from liberal economists themselves, and then turned it against them.
Clever. So for Marx, these unequal rewards aren't just income differences, they're exploitation.
Exactly. Because property, in his view, fundamentally becomes the power of disposing of the labor power of others. It's control over other people's work.
And that control is inherently exploitive.
The example used is that first split mental versus material labor. The intellectual group, now having a form of property, control over knowledge, maybe organization, can compel others to work.
To provide them with the leisure time they need for their higher activities.
And this primitive form, Marx suggests, is the basic model for all later forms of class exploitation throughout history.
And flowing directly from this exploitation comes conflict.
Inevitably, Marx argues, class exploitation must lead to class conflict. The exploited group will resist.
Even if that resistance isn't always obvious, like open revolt.
Right. The source notes resistance takes many forms, sometimes subtle, sometimes not even recognized as resistance by those doing it, but the underlying dynamic is struggle.
So the core takeaway from this whole materialist interpretation, boiled down, is that famous line.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, from the Communist Manifesto.
Capitalist society, with capitalists exploiting the proletariat, is just the latest chapter in this ongoing story.
Precisely. And it all derives logically, Marx believed, from that basic starting point. Humans must live materially to make history. It leads to this whole sociology of class conflict.
Which is, as the source emphasizes, a radically different picture than you get from idealist philosophies, focusing on ideas or spirit.
Absolutely. And Marx then uses this materialist view to try and explain idealism itself. Why do people even think in idealist ways?
Which brings us to that really crucial psychological implication he draws. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life.
Yeah. What we think, what we believe, our values, our whole understanding of the world, our consciousness is shaped and determined by a real material life.
Meaning our role in production, the division of labor, the class system we're part of, the exploitation and conflict we experience.
All of that shapes how we think. But Marx isn't saying consciousness is just like a puppet on strings.
The source clarifies that, right? It's not mechanical.
No, that would be too simplistic, another kind of error. Consciousness is part of material life. It's how the material brain organizes and reflects material reality.
And it does interact with reality, it shapes it to some extent.
But always within the parameters, the limits and possibilities set by the larger social reality, by the class structure.
So a given class system sets the stage for the kind of consciousness that prevails.
That's the idea. Different classes might develop unique class consciousness based on their specific positions. But overall, society tends to develop a common stock of values, beliefs, attitudes.
That basically justify the way things are, justify the existing society and its class relations.
And crucially, if the way we produce things changes, if the class relations shift significantly,
then consciousness must change too, the source quotes Marx. Men developing their material production alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their thinking. Living differently makes you think differently. He developed this further with the idea of the economic base and the superstructure, right?
Right.
In the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy.
Yes. He argues the relations of production, the class system, correspond to the stage of technology, the productive forces. The sum of these relations is the economic structure of society, the real foundation.
The base. And on top of this base,
Rises a legal and political superstructure and also definite forms of social consciousness, like philosophy, religion, art, morality.
so the core argument is
Mhm.
the economic base, how society organizes production and class, determines the superstructure. The legal system, political institutions, and the dominant ideas and values.
Economic structure determines political structure and the beliefs that go with it.
Okay, but here's where the critique gets really sharp, according to the source. This consciousness, these ideas and beliefs in the superstructure, they're often wrong.
Exactly. They constitute misperceptions of social reality. Life determines consciousness, yes, but that doesn't mean consciousness sees life clearly or truly.
Instead, consciousness often mistakes reality.
And this is the really insidious part. It often justifies the very reality that created the misperceptions in the first place. It reinforces the system.
And this is what Marx calls false consciousness, his specific definition of ideology.
Right. The source emphasizes this is a particular meaning, distinct from just a system of beliefs. For Marx, ideology is false consciousness.
And this tendency to generate ideology, this false consciousness, is a key feature of any society divided by class.
And guess what he includes as a prime example of ideology?
Idealism itself, the very philosophy he's arguing against.
Precisely. He sees it as a form of false perception. Specifically, the source says, a kind of religious ideology in the guise of a philosophy.
Why really?
Because the core of religious ideology, for Marx, is assuming God makes man. He flips it. Man makes God. And man makes the whole superstructure of consciousness, religion, philosophy, politics, through material development.
And religious ideology promotes the illusion that consciousness, God, spirit, the soul, is independent, higher, more real than the messy material world.
And idealism, Marx argues, does the exact same thing in philosophical terms, puts ideas or spirit first.
No wonder, he says, idealists end up talking about history in terms of pure thoughts instead of real material interests and struggles. They're often the realm of the pure spirit.
But the problem isn't just that idealism misperceives reality. The bigger issue, the source stresses,
Is that, like any ideology, it helps keep things the way they are. It perpetuates the social conditions, the class divisions that created it.
ideologies maintain the existing class relations.
The source brings up the famous opium of the people line about religion.
Yeah. Religion provides a psychic escape for the suffering worker, promises justice later, in heaven if you accept injustice now.
So it stops workers from challenging the actual source of their misery, the class system. It dulls the pain, but prevents action, like opium.
And the source suggests idealism can function similarly for intellectuals, an opium of the intellectual.
Same mechanism. Religious ideology and philosophical clothes, dulling critical thinking.
Kind of, by focusing on abstract spiritual realities that supposedly transcend everyday human suffering, the idealist intellectual is less likely to grasp the class basis of that suffering.
And therefore less likely to play a critical role in changing society.
Exactly. So, idealism doesn't just come from class relations, it helps maintain them. But how exactly does it arise?
Marx's answer, presented as brilliant here, links it right back to that division of labor we talked about.
Remember, life determines consciousness. If that's true, then the idealist idea that consciousness determines life must come from some kind of distortion or inversion in social life itself.
And that happens when mental and material labor first split apart.
Precisely. When society produces enough surplus to support a separate group of thinkers, intellectuals, then idealism becomes possible.
The source quotes Marx. Consciousness can really flatter itself that it is something other than consciousness of existing practice. It can think it's free from the material world.
From now on, consciousness is in a position to emancipate itself from the world and to proceed to the formation of pure theory, theology, philosophy, ethics, etc.
So the conclusion is pretty stark. Idealism needs a separate intellectual class to exist.
And the broader point, class exploitation is the fundamental source of idealist philosophies, and maybe all forms of false consciousness.
But why? What's the mechanism connecting that division to idealism?
It goes back to the division of labor also being a division of property. The intellectual class isn't just doing different work, they get rewarded more for it. They gain a kind of property control over ideas, knowledge. They become socially superior.
And that superior social position shapes their thinking.
Yes. Because they are socially superior, they start to believe their role, and crucially, the products of their role, ideas, theories, are also superior to the material world.
And they create philosophies that reflect that belief. Philosophies where ideas, spirit, God, whatever, are higher than mere matter.
Exactly. That's why idealism often posits some purely intellectual reality as the ultimate cause or ground of the material world.
The source uses Plato's theory of forms as the classic example. The perfect, unchanging forms are the true reality. Our world is just a shadow.
And politically, Plato argued justice means conforming to the ideal form of justice, which only philosopher rulers truly grasp.
So Marx reads this as Plato's philosophy is tied to his social position. Philosophers were socially superior due to the mental-material labor split. They thought they should rule and created an idealist theory to justify it, a theory only they understood.
It's a devastating critique. Marx basically reduces the entire idealist tradition since Plato to ideology, a product of class relations.
And he even includes earlier materialist philosophies in this critique.
Yeah, because they kept that detached theoretical attitude, didn't engage practically. So they also, in a way, failed to escape the trap, failed to see how their own theories were conditioned.
By showing this link between social class and idealist philosophy, how one grew out of the other, Marx felt he'd proven his core idea. Life determines consciousness.
So rejecting idealism was step one. The next step, the real job, was to establish the truth of this world.
Which
Analyzing people's actual material conditions, understanding the capitalist system, its flaws, and the possibilities for change now that the ideological smokescreen was hopefully cleared away.
and the fundamental truth Marx found in that analysis.
According to this source, it's that the capitalist system is inherently self-destructive. It's got internal economic contradictions it just can't solve.
Leading inevitably to its collapse.
Yes, collapse of the economic system, and therefore collapse of its political superstructure and its forms of false consciousness, too. It's historically inevitable, he argued.
And not only is capitalism doomed,
But communism must, just as inevitably, rise from its ruins. That's the claim.
okay, so the source gives a quick summary of the economic argument from Capital. How does that work?
Well, the basic premise is that capitalism, like earlier systems, is built on class exploitation.
Exploitation is baked into the nature of capital itself.
Yes, which Marx sees as nothing more than expropriated labor. Profit, for the capitalist, comes from surplus value.
Surplus value being.
The value created by workers above and beyond the value of their own wages. Workers get paid a subsistence wage, just enough to keep them working.
But they produce much more value than that during their workday.
Exactly. And that extra value, the surplus, is taken by the capitalist as profit. That profit is capital. The source notes capital and wage labor are basically two sides of the same coin for Marx.
And this relies on the labor theory of value.
Right, which, the source points out, Marx actually got from liberal economists like Smith and Ricardo. The idea that a thing's value comes from the labor needed to produce it.
So capitalist profit is literally taking value that workers created. How does the capitalist manage that?
Simple compulsion, really. The capitalist forces workers to work longer than needed to produce the value equivalent to their wage. Say, 8 hours covers the wage, but they work 12 or 16. The value from those extra hours is the surplus value, the profit.
Okay, but why do workers put up with it?
Marx's blunt answer, quoted here. They have no other choice. The capitalists own the means of production, factories, machines, everything needed to work. Workers own only their ability to labor. They have to sell it to survive.
But the source adds an interesting twist. The capitalists don't really have a choice either.
In a way, no. The competitive market forces them to constantly chase profit, accumulate capital. If they don't, they go under. They face economic doom.
So they're also victims of the system's logic, in a sense.
As much victims as are the workers, the source quotes, compelled by the relations of production. It's a systemic pressure.
And this system turns workers into commodities.
Pretty much. Bought and sold on the market at the lowest price their wage. Their value is just their labor power, not their humanity.
And Marx thought this exploitation under capitalism was worse than in earlier systems, like feudalism.
Much worse, he argued. Feudal serfs, maybe, had some traditional protections, some guaranteed livelihood, some sense of community or mutual obligation, however unequal.
Whereas capitalism, the source quotes Marx, stripped all that away. It has put an end to all feudal relations and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man the naked self-interest than callous cash payment.
The human connection is gone. It's just about the money. So the proletariat isn't just poor.
They're quite literally dehumanized. That's a strong phrase.
It is. And Marx used the concept of alienation to describe this dehumanization.
Alienation meaning?
Separation. Separation of our essential human qualities, what he called our species being, our creativity, our social nature from ourselves. These qualities get turned into external structures of domination that control us.
And the root cause is capitalist private property, the class division.
Yes. Workers are separated from the capitalists who own the means of production and then dominated by them. That separation allows the domination. It alienates us from our innate human capacity for community.
And this alienation affects every part of the worker's life.
It makes the whole world an alienated reality for them. The source breaks it down.
Okay.
First, alienated from the fruit of their labor, the things they make. That value is taken as profit, becomes capital, which then dominates them. What should be an expression of their humanity becomes a tool used against them.
Second,
alienated from the technology itself. The machines aren't tools extending their power. The worker becomes just an appendage of the machine. Because they don't own it, they serve it on the capitalist's terms.
and the worst form of alienation.
Self-alienation. By losing the power to act creatively on the world, workers lose the power to even understand that world properly.
Because life determines consciousness.
An alienated life produces an alienated consciousness, which is false consciousness, ideology.
Blinding workers to their real situation, preventing change, a kind of mental domination on top of the economic kind.
Exactly. It locks the system in place.
So, okay, we have this picture. Intense exploitation, misery. Workers literally dehumanized, even their minds clouded by false consciousness.
Yeah.
It sounds like a pretty stable system of oppression.
It does, doesn't it? So the source asks the obvious question. How could Marx be so sure it was inevitably going to collapse?
Right. Where's the escape hatch?
Marx argued there's a catch, a fatal flaw, an inherent contradiction that capitalism simply cannot fix.
And that is?
The inevitable tendency for the overall rate of profit to fall across the system over time, the law of the falling rate of profit.
He thought this was like a law of physics, unbreakable.
Pretty much. He believed it was baked into the system's logic.
Okay, how does the reasoning go, according to the summary here?
It starts with competition. Capitalists compete for labor, workers compete to sell labor. Competition for labor tends to drive wages up.
And if wages go up, profits, the surplus value extracted, tend to go down.
Right. So to keep profits up, the capitalist has to find ways to push wages back down. What's the main way they do that?
Introduce machines, labor-saving technology.
Exactly. Machines increase efficiency, but they also cause unemployment, creating that industrial reserve army of jobless workers.
And a big pool of desperate unemployed workers competing for fewer jobs.
Makes labor cheap again, depresses wages, and that boosts profits. But only in the short term.
Ah, only short term. Why?
Because, remember the labor theory of value. Labor is the source of new value. If you employ less labor overall because you're using more machines,
You're creating less total new value in the economy.
right, machines transfer their own value, but they don't create new value beyond that. They only boost surplus value indirectly by making labor cheaper.
And there's another problem, right? More unemployment means fewer people can buy stuff.
Exactly. Fewer customers with wages. So the very thing capitalists do to boost profits, mechanize, create unemployment, ultimately undermines the market for their products. It backfires in the long run.
And they can't stop doing it.
No, because of competition. If one capitalist introduces new tech, the others have to follow suit or risk being undercut and driven out of business. Failed capitalists join the proletariat.
So everyone's trapped, workers and capitalists alike, forced into this self-destructive pattern by the system itself.
That's the core of the contradiction Marx identified.
And Marx generalized this dynamic beyond just falling profits.
Yeah, he saw it as a general principle. At a certain point, the material productive forces, the technology, the capacity to produce,
Come into conflict with the existing relations of production, the class structure, the property system.
the way society is organized starts to hold back the rational use of its own productive power. In capitalism, tech advances make workers more miserable and the system less stable.
And the system breaks down when that conflict becomes too great, when it can't contain the forces it has unleashed.
Yes. At the point where all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, it sort of bursts at the seams.
But before the final collapse, things get worse. More desperate.
Yeah, capitalism engages in increasingly irrational attempts to survive. Competition gets fiercer. Frantic tech introduction leads to overproduction, then crashes, unemployment. What Marx called the anarchy of production.
Leading to those periodic depressions the source mentions.
Right. Where factories close, machines rust, people starve. Marx has that striking quote about society finding itself in momentary barbarism.
And the paradox is,
Yeah.
it happens because there's too much.
Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The system's productive power outstrips its ability to manage it rationally under capitalist rules.
But one crash doesn't end it.
No. The source says a depression clears the decks, allows the cycle to restart temporarily. Finding new markets, like through colonialism, can also delay the next crisis.
Which later Marxists like Lenin picked up on.
Exactly. But for Marx, the underlying law of the falling rate of profit is relentless. It forces capitalism to spread globally, making the whole world one system.
Which just means the crises become bigger, more widespread.
And there are fewer places left to expand into to escape the internal problems.
And behind all this economic theory falling profits, crises is the human cost. Growing misery, growing alienation for the proletariat.
That's the crucial driver. The more capitalism produces and advances, the more unbearable life becomes for the majority.
So the inevitable economic collapse leads to the inevitable revolution.
Mm.
The system creates its own destroyers.
Produces, above all, is its own gravediggers, as Marx famously put it.
And the final quote from Capital the source uses.
A knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. The end of the line for capitalism.
Okay, so this whole analysis, the historical stages, the contradictions, the inevitable outcome, the source says it's deeply dialectical.
Yes, it's built on a dialectical model of change, which Marx, maybe ironically, took from Hegel.
Right, Hegel's dialectic.
Yeah.
The idea that truth comes from contradictions. Things aren't just static, A or B.
Yeah, it's about dynamic tension. Something is and is not at the same time. These internal contradictions drive a process of transformation into something new, a higher stage or synthesis.
And Hegel saw this not just as a way of arguing, but as how reality itself works. History, nature, consciousness.
He did. The logic of history, for Hegel, was this unfolding dialectic. Each stage contains contradictions that push it towards the next higher stage.
But Hegel's version was idealist, driven by the absolute idea, some kind of spirit realizing itself.
Exactly. History culminates when consciousness recognizes this ultimate spiritual reality. Each era is the highest point so far towards that goal.
And this could be used conservatively, right, to justify the current system.
Yes. Hegel's phrase, what is real is rational, was often taken to mean whatever exists now, like the Prussian state, is rational and justified because it's the necessary current stage of the dialectic.
So how did Marx use the dialectic differently? He kept the method, but changed the content.
Totally. He rejected the idealism, the absolute idea, the spirit called it idealist nonsense religious ideology. For Marx, the dialectic expresses the material reality of class conflict. Contradictions in the economic base drive historical change.
And he flipped the political implication, too.
Absolutely. He took Hegel's real is rational, but added the inverse. The rational is real, meaning it's rational, even necessary, to strive for the next stage if it's dialectically inevitable.
Leading to Engels' line, all that exists deserves to perish. If it's contradictory and holding back progress, it's destined to be overthrown.
Right. So the revolution from capitalism, the real, to communism, the rational, the next stage, is legitimized by this dialectical logic. Marx essentially put Hegel's dialectic on its feet, grounding it in material reality.
But the dialectic for Marx isn't just abstract logic. It's a tool, a perspective for analyzing the real world.
Yes. It needs concrete, empirical study of capitalism's structures and tendencies, the truth of this world, but viewed through this lens of contradiction and transformation.
And the source argues his analysis is deeply dialectical, like the relationship between capitalist and proletariat.
Perfect example. They're an organic unity of opposites, is and is not.
Capitalist creates the proletariat by driving accumulation.
Proletariat creates the capitalist by providing the surplus value, mutual self-creation.
But because it's based on exploitation, it becomes mutual self-description, creating the grave diggers.
Exactly. And the proletariat can't destroy the capitalists without also destroying themselves as a class slave mine. Labor needs capital to exploit it. That's the negation of the negation.
Leading to something entirely new, a classless society, a higher synthesis.
Which, according to Marx's whole framework, must transform everything, law, politics, consciousness, because the economic base has been revolutionized.
The source asks, how valid is this? acknowledges critiques of the dialectic itself.
Sure, philosophical debates exist, but the source also presents the Marxist defense. The dialectic seems more realistic than, say, classical liberalism.
How so?
It highlights the interconnected organic nature of society, and it foregrounds conflict, especially class conflict, which liberalism tended to ignore or minimize.
And it forces you to see society as dynamic,
Right.
always changing, looking for those internal tensions, pushing toward something new.
Whereas classical liberalism, the source suggests, saw society more like a collection of separate individuals, social atomism, less sense of deep structure, conflict, or radical transformation from within.
They saw the facts of capitalism very differently.
Right, so the question becomes which model, the dialectical conflict model or the individualist liberal model, better explains the facts, if either.
Okay, but then the source raises some big problems, challenges within Marx's own framework.
Yeah, two major ones highlighted here. First, even if the revolution happens, how do we know it leads to a classless society?
What stops the victorious proletariat from just becoming the new bosses, like other revolutions in history?
Good question. Marx's answer, the source explains, goes back to life determines consciousness. Worker consciousness is limited while capitalism works. But when it breaks down, when misery is unbearable.
They're forced to see things clearly, face with sober senses his real conditions.
Right. And because of their unique position, total propertylessness, total alienation, Marx believed they gain a unique insight.
An insight that private property and class itself is the problem, the source of dehumanization.
Exactly, and that only abolishing it completely can bring about true human liberation. No previous class had this radical potential, Marx argued. Their material life gives them this world historical understanding.
So for Marx, communism is inevitable because the proletariat's revolution, driven by this unique insight born of suffering, is inevitable.
That's the logic. But it leads straight to the second problem, the paradox of praxis.
If it's all inevitable, why bother? Why write manifestos, organize parties, call for revolution? Doesn't that imply it might not happen on its own?
It seems contradictory. Marx's answer, the source says, is that humans are both determined and determining. History unfolds by laws, but humans are the actors who make it unfold.
So saying workers will revolt is also saying they ought to revolt, uniting the I's and the ought.
Yes. That unity is praxis, theory, objective analysis, plus practice, revolutionary action. You need both to change the world, even if the change is ultimately inevitable.
He developed this idea of praxis in the theses on Feuerbach, critiquing another materialist.
Right, Ludwig Feuerbach. Marx felt Feuerbach made materialism passive, just contemplation, not action.
Thesis 1 says the problem with earlier materialism was seeing reality only as something to look at, not as human sensuous activity practice, something we actively shape.
They miss the two-way street. Material reality shapes us, yes, but our actions, our practice, shape material reality in return.
Thesis 3 makes that point. Materialists say circumstances shape people, but they forget it is men that change circumstances.
We are determined by conditions, but we also determine the conditions we are determined by. It's dialectical.
But doesn't that contradict life determines consciousness? If our consciousness, ideas, will can change circumstances.
Marx says no, because consciousness isn't separate from material life. It's part of it. Feuerbach, by just contemplating, actually fell back into separating mind and reality like the idealists.
So, asserting that our understanding and action can change the world isn't anti-materialist.
It's a necessary conclusion of a dialectical active materialism, Marx argued.
But the theory has to be right for the action to work.
Yes. False consciousness won't change the world effectively. Correct understanding, theory, plus revolutionary action, practice, will succeed in the long run, Marx believed, because it aligns with history's inevitable path.
And the proletariat is key here. Their life conditions force them to grasp reality theory and act to change it, practice.
They are the actual material embodiment of Marxian praxis, as the source puts it.
So how do we know if Marxist theory itself is correct?
Through praxis, that's the test. Does the theory work in practice? Does applying it lead to the predicted revolution and the creation of communism?
If yes, it's verified. If no, it needs changing or rejecting.
So the ultimate proof, the material validation of Marxism, lies in the proletariat actually succeeding in its revolutionary task.
This idea that revolution is a way of knowing, revolution is an epistemology. The source calls that truly radical in Western thought.
Totally. It flips conventional epistemology on its head. The Western tradition, idealist or materialist, generally saw objectivity as detachment, standing back. Interfering subjectively ruins the analysis.
Marx says the opposite.
Yeah.
Unless you intervene, unless you try to change reality based on your theory, you can never truly know if it's valid. You remain trapped in contemplation.
And if you just contemplate, you're implicitly accepting reality as it is. Your theory becomes just another ideology, justifying the status quo because it never challenges it through action.
This connects to his critique of all Western philosophy. Idealism obscures reality.
And even earlier materialism, by being purely contemplative, did too. It perpetuated the intellectual manual labor split, the class division in miniature. They couldn't see how their theories confirmed the hierarchy because they stayed aloof.
The source even claims 17th century onwards materialism was basically a defense of liberal capitalism.
Yeah. Thesis 9 critique, focusing on the contemplation of single individuals in civil society, just took the individualism of emerging capitalism for granted.
Thinkers like Hobbes and Locke assumed self-interest and property-seeking were innate human nature.
When, for Marx, those were products of the specific capitalist conditions they were observing. The reality shaped the theory, not the other way around. Liberalism described alienated man, not man as such.
So by insisting on praxis, on changing reality as the test of truth, Marx thought he'd finally broken free from ideology. Revolutionary practice reveals the truth and exposes the flaws in previous thought.
But the source flags the deep irony. This very reliance on practice for validation becomes the biggest challenge to Marxism itself later on. The paradox bites back.
Before we get to those challenges, let's quickly sketch out Marx's vision for the communist society that follows capitalism based on the source.
Okay, core feature. Classless society, achieved by eliminating capitalist private property.
But not all property. Personal stuff is okay.
Right. Your clothes, your house things, for personal use, not for making profit off others' labor. That remains legitimate.
And eliminating private property means eliminating the rigid division of labor, since they're identical expressions.
Yes. No more being stuck in one job your whole life. People could do many different things.
The source has that famous quote, "Hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, criticize after dinner," without being locked into one role.
Right. Developing all human capacities, contributing freely to society, not for exploitation.
And the definition of this society.
One in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Mutual flourishing.
What about the state? Politics.
They disappear. The state, for Marx, is just the political arm of the ruling class. No class has no need for a state. It withers away.
Political decisions become collective. Social decisions made by everyone.
And the biggest change is in people themselves. Their consciousness. Eliminate alienation in society, you eliminate alienated consciousness.
People wouldn't be driven by greed for property or power, because those wouldn't exist as driving forces.
That's the idea. A completely different motivation. No need for God to promise justice later, or philosophy to escape a bad reality. Consciousness could focus on scientifically understanding and improving the shared material world.
Okay, sounds utopian.
Yeah.
The source immediately asks, how realistic is this? Acknowledges the track record of communist states isn't great.
Yeah, it's pragmatic. Says we can't know until it's really tried. But it does defend the vision against some common theoretical criticisms.
Like modern society is too complex, you need division of labor.
Marx's view, the source notes, was that industrialization and automation actually enable overcoming rigid divisions. Machines do the drudgery, tasks simplify, people can do varied things, manage a factory, write poetry.
Even if some specialization remains, it doesn't have to mean unequal property or power.
Exactly. A specialist doesn't automatically get more just because they specialize.
What about incentives? People won't do skilled work without higher pay?
The source says this assumes capitalist consciousness, scarcity, competition. Marx envisioned a society of abundance thanks to technology freed from class constraints. Enough for everyone. The desire for unequal rewards, rooted in capitalism, would disappear.
And the state? You need it for order.
The source pushes back. That's an assumption. Maybe political power is only needed for class rule. Maybe collective decision-making doesn't require a separate state bureaucracy. Especially if society is simpler, people have more leisure and capacity to participate.
So Marx wasn't against organization, just against the state as a tool of power.
Right. You still need coordination. But leaders act for the community cooperatively. Roles could rotate. No chance for power to solidify. And transformed consciousness means no desire for it to. Lead without being a permanent leader.
But all these practical points boil down to one big criticism, the source says. It's against human nature.
The fundamental objection. People are just inherently selfish, competitive, always want more. You can't change that. So communism is impossible.
And Marx's response.
Flips it again. That's confusing cause and effect. Life determines consciousness. Critics assume some fixed innate psychology determines society.
Marx says there is no fixed human nature, only social nature. We are products of our social relations, the ensemble of the social relations.
Capitalist society produces capitalist people competitive, acquisitive. Change the relations to communist ones, you'll get communist people cooperative, non-acquisitive. History shows consciousness changes, he argued.
So the liberal view of humans as inherently individualistic and greedy is just alienated theory, reflecting people under capitalism, not people as they truly could be.
Exactly. Liberalism itself is false consciousness, an ideology produced by capitalism destined to vanish with it.
And the ultimate answer Marx offered wasn't another argument, but
The actual creation of a communist society. Praxis again. Only building it proves it's possible and exposes the limits of the critic's views.
this critique extends beyond liberalism to the whole Western tradition, the source argues, seeing it all as alienated theory.
Which makes Marx an anti-political theorist. He doesn't play the traditional game of defining justice, the ideal state, etc. He rejects those categories as ideological.
They're irrelevant in a classless future, or just tools of oppression now.
Right. Asking what is the just state assumes the state is necessary and can be just. Marx denied both within a class context.
The source uses the example of majority tyranny, a liberal concern. Marx would say that problem only exists within the alienated framework of liberal capitalism. No classes, no desire for advantage, the problem dissolves.
So his influence is almost wholly negative in terms of traditional political thought. He tears down, he doesn't build within that framework.
But that's his importance, that negativity forces a radical rethink.
Yes, it compels us to question the foundations. Could the whole tradition be flawed, ideological? Could we have been on the wrong track since the beginning? He raises those questions brilliantly and uncompromisingly. You can't ignore them, and here's the final twist. He raises them in a way that ultimately relies on his own system's premise being proven true.
The premise that theory is confirmed in practice.
Praxis. And the truth of Marxism rests on the proletariat actually doing it, creating communism through revolution.
And the historical record.
That's the massive problem the source lays out. The proletariat didn't fulfill its historic task in the way predicted, especially in advanced capitalist countries.
Or where revolutions did happen in Marx's name, the outcomes were starkly different from his vision.
The source points to the general failure of the industrial working class to become revolutionary in the West. Maybe because conditions improved, easing the worst exploitation, they became integrated, maybe nationalism trumped class.
Whatever the reason, the failure happened, which, in strict Marxian terms,
could mean the theory was wrong. Capitalism wasn't inevitably collapsing as predicted. If the system didn't disintegrate, the revolutionary consciousness didn't fully emerge. Maybe the analysis of capitalism or historical materialism was flawed.
This led to revisionism. Marxists like Bernstein saying, okay, reality isn't matching the theory.
Exactly. Early 20th century, Bernstein saw capitalism stabilizing and said, we have to revise. Socialism should be a moral ideal we work towards gradually, through reform, not an inevitable revolutionary outcome.
But orthodox Marxists pushed back hard.
Fiercely. People like Lenin, they saw the scientific claim of Marxism at stake. If it's just a moral ideal, it's no better than utopianism.
Lenin's counter-argument involved imperialism.
Yes. Capitalism temporarily stabilized itself, he argued, by exploiting colonies, using super profits from cheap labor and resources overseas to bribe a section of the home working class with slightly higher wages, making them less revolutionary.
But this only delayed the inevitable for Lenin. It actually confirmed Marx globally.
Right. Capitalism was now worldwide. Eventually, as the colonies industrialized, the global system would hit crisis point, leading to world revolution. The source dryly notes this prediction hasn't exactly panned out yet.
And even if Lenin was right about inevitability, there's the other problem. What actually happened in countries that had Marxist revolutions?
The outcomes were completely contrary to Marx's vision. The state didn't wither away. It became massive, often totalitarian. Power wasn't communal. It was held by an elite communist party.
The source suggests state growth might have been inevitable with industrialization anyway, but the party domination was specific.
And linked to Lenin, the founder of that kind of disciplined, hierarchical, professional revolutionary party, the source notes Marx himself probably would have rejected that model.
Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917. Why did he want that kind of party?
Tsarist repression made open organizing impossible, he argued. And Russia was mostly agrarian, small working class, needed a dedicated vanguard to lead them.
Other Marxists objected, said Russia wasn't ready, violating the theory.
Yes. Accused him of pushing history, replacing the spontaneous uprising Marx predicted with the conscious will of the party. Reversing life determines consciousness.
Lenin disagreed. Thought revolution on the periphery could spark global change.
But the source brings it back to the test, the outcome in practice. The Western proletariat didn't revolt as predicted, and the Leninist states produced results totally at odds with the theory. Party power, bureaucracy, not communism.
Marxist theory even got used to justify that outcome, often with nationalism mixed in.
So the conclusion drawn here is stark. The unity of Marxist theory and praxis has disintegrated. History didn't confirm the theory.
And by Marx's own standard.
Marxism is wanting. It failed the practical test.
Though the source acknowledges orthodox Marxists still hold out hope, the story isn't over yet.
And non-Marxists mostly see the Soviet collapse as the final nail in the coffin. Confirmation of failure, triumph of capitalism.
Although the source adds a wrinkle. Maybe the global spread of capitalism is creating the conditions Marx talked about, and the 20th century versions were distortions. Maybe a rebirth is possible for the theory, freed from those regimes.
It's a perspective mentioned, but the core challenge remains. If the theory failed in practice, by its own rules, isn't Marxism now just ideology? False consciousness?
Especially how ruling regimes used it, misrepresenting reality, justifying power, preventing real change. The source quotes Avenari, Marx didn't apply the critique to his own theory.
But even so, even if Marxism itself became an ideology, the source argues its value remains immense.
Why?
Because the critique it offers of Western thought, of idealism, exploitation, ideology, the state that critique might still be valid.
And if it is valid, if the whole tradition is built on shaky ideological ground,
then we have a serious problem. No reliable tradition to stand on, Marxism included. Marx becomes this intellectual nemesis, not because he was right about the future,
but because his questions were so radical, so fundamental, they force us to rethink everything. Could our own beliefs be false consciousness? Are we still asking the wrong questions? You can't just ignore him. Wow, that really was a deep dive into this material on Marxism.
It really laid out the core arguments, didn't it? The critique of capitalism from that materialist perspective, class conflict, alienation, ideology.
And that vision of a communist society emerging from capitalism's own contradictions. Powerful stuff.
But also, it didn't pull punches on the challenges, the historical outcomes, the tension with Marx's own idea of praxis as the ultimate test.
Yeah, regardless of how history actually played out versus the predictions, this source material makes it clear. Marx asks some profoundly unsettling questions about society, about consciousness, about the bedrock of Western political ideas, questions that still echo.
Definitely leaves you with a lot to chew on. As you listen to us go through this summary, what aspects really stood out or resonated with you?
And maybe here's the really provocative thought to take away from this deep dive.
If Marx was onto something, even partially, about ideology being false consciousness generated by our material lives, by our economic and social structures.
What does that imply about our beliefs today? Our common sense, the things we just assume are true?
Is it possible that some of the ideas we take completely for granted are also, in a way, forms of false consciousness, shaped by the world we live in now, subtly reinforcing the status quo without us even realizing it?
Definitely something to mull over.
Thanks for joining us for this exploration of the complex ideas presented in the source material. We hope it's given you a useful framework for understanding this challenging thinker.